welcome to TELSIG. This is Phil Martin from the University of York. I'll kick this episode off by just saying a big thanks to all the presenters and audience members at the TELSIG Symposium earlier this month. It was a really nice event, a really friendly and vibrant atmosphere and some great talks. We're hoping to get more of these organised in the near future, so do watch this space. So today I'm talking to Lily Abadal and Nidhi Sachdeva to pick up on one of the sub-themes from the symposium, which was digital detoxing and ways in which we can manage that sort of sense of tech saturation in the classroom. Both Lily and Nidhi are quite well placed to talk about this. Lily is Assistant Professor of Instruction in the Philosophy Department at the University of South Florida, and she's been bringing long-form writing back into the classroom. And she argues for the learning benefits of this approach as opposed to take-home assignments. This will also be of interest for anyone looking for some options for AI-free assignments and assessments at the moment, which is probably quite a few of us. Nidhi Sachdeva is a teacher and researcher in the field of science of learning. Nidhi's been on the podcast before, where she talks us through some popular learning myths. And Nidhi brings us up to speed on what studies show about paper versus screen-based writing and learning, where tech is useful, when it's time to unplug. Both Nidhi and Lily have written and spoken quite widely about these topics, and they're frequent guests on other podcasts. So I'll link to where you can find more of their work in the show notes, including their own Substack pages. And with that done, let's get to it. And now I bring you Lily Abadal and Nidhi Sachdeva. I'm here with Lily Abadal from the University of South Florida and Nidhi Sachdeva from the University of Toronto. Glad we can actually make this happen because you've both been a huge influence on my teaching. And I'm hoping we can get into things like digital detoxes and when it's useful and when it can be healthy to kind of unplug from the classroom. But before we get into all that, I'll just do some brief intros, and I'll start with Lily. I'm sure actually there'll be some of our listeners who are familiar with you, who have heard you elsewhere and have read your stuff. Maybe you just give us a quick bird's eye view of your approach to bringing slow writing back into the classroom, unplugging, and where you are with your course at the moment. It's philosophy you're doing this on, is that right?
Yes. So just a little background. So I got my dissertation or finished my PhD in 2019. I had actually been away from academia for a couple of years. And then when I came back and decided to re-enter the university, it was the same year that ChatGPT was released to the public, if you will. I think it was November 2022 or something like that. And I was very, very unprepared for the way I had been structuring my classes, the way I was doing assessments. I feel like in some ways people had been kind of slowly catching up with some of the changes in higher education because of COVID. That was right before. But I didn't have any of that time to get myself ready for all of the things that I was experiencing, all the newness and change. So I realized that I had to radically shift my model, which most philosophy professors required a lot of out of class writing. I kind of was racking my brain trying to think of how can I preserve some element of the classical term paper, which I felt as a philosopher had a lot of value. I didn't want students to write just a short 5-paragraph essay, that they had learned how to do in middle school. I wanted them to do a lot more synthesis of more material. I wanted them to be thinking through a lot more slowly and carefully through arguments that were not, in my view, something that they could quickly engage with and write on in a small 30-minute period, or, even if you gave them the entire hour, in a class period, really. So the solution that I had come up with and that I'm still working through and trying to perfect kind of each semester, making some changes and refining it as I go along, is I have divided up the term paper that I would typically assign into smaller portions, smaller assignments to be done within the context of the classroom. So kind of for me, that has really transformed my whole pedagogy. It's made me really rethink everything that I was doing in the classroom. And slowly, as that's been happening, first it started with just redesigning some of those assessments. Now I'm kind of moving more and more towards redesigning my entire classroom culture to redirect attention in ways that allow for the depth of discussion and dialogue that I'm hoping for. And a lot of that means creating intentional spaces for silence, creating intentional spaces in the classroom that students do not have the temptation of technology, taking students outside when the weather permits. And I do live in Florida, so it permits often, um, thankfully. And yeah, so many other things, but that was probably a longer introduction than I had planned when I had started. So I will give it back to you.
That's cool. Actually, just one question before I check in with Nidhi. But what is it? Is the writing part that I think you mentioned before that was something you do once a week? It's not every class, is that right?
Yes. Right. So it works out to be roughly every week. There are some weeks where I have some breaks. That might be if I'm gearing up to do a longer in-class portion. So before I have them do the argument map, I go through, some of the specifics the week before in the class time that I would have had them write on how to actually construct a good argument. And we talk a little bit about some like basic aspects of informal logic. So many of these things that are required for good writing for a philosophy paper are not like learned elsewhere. So I have to do a little teaching as far as that goes. So yeah, pretty much it works out to be roughly every week. And I do half of the class once a week, which for, in the United States, at my particular university, that ends up being about 30 to 45 minutes once a week.
And the rest of the time, is it kind of still device free, even when they're not writing, or is that?
Yes. I try to encourage that as much as possible without like policing heavily. So like, I try not to be too paternalistic where I go up to students and like individually ask them to put their phone away. I feel like that's not my place. I try more to invite them into the space that I want to create. And this semester I did that by actually taking the entire first class to kind of do some thought experiments and some exercises on the importance of silence and quiet and how certain technologies distract us from being able to do deep thinking. And then after we had like done all of this discussion, it had nothing to do with like the policies on the syllabus or anything. And then after we had done all of that, I asked them to come up with like, what would be the ideal conditions in this class for us to think really deeply about these big questions. And they came up with it themselves. So they were like, yes, my phone is really distracting. My laptop's really distracting. And it's worked pretty well so far. If I do notice that a lot of students are getting to a place where they're checking their phones a lot, I will. And something I've been trying this semester is having just a 2-minute like redirect. So I'll just be like, okay, I'm noticing some people are a little distracted. Let's put everything away and just take 2 minutes to like regroup and refocus our attention. And that's been helpful too.
Cool. Yeah. And Nidhi, I hope you're getting the idea of why I was so keen to have you here. Do you subscribe to Paul Kirshner's blog? And he was posting about an article he reviewed recently about taking devices out of the class. And we've spoken offline about the digital delusion. So can you just give us your sense of this so far? Where are you at with technology in the classroom? When do you find it helpful? And what does your own classroom look like?
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Thank you, first of all, Phil, for inviting us into this really, I think, essential discussion. And I want to start by really saying that it's not about polarization, because technology has really helped us, right? Because it's so easy. I've seen that with reading, I've seen that with math, and now with EdTech. Like what we don't want to do is have another war, because that's completely counterproductive. So I just want to truly start off with that. So the listeners and anybody who's slightly so interested in this conversation or more is clear that that's not the purpose. The purpose is really understanding thoughtful pedagogy around EdTech. So I'll also briefly mention what I do. So I'm a researcher and teacher educator at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. And my work really focuses on the science of learning, how learning happens, evidence-informed instruction, teacher expertise. And my PhD work was actually designing evidence-informed micro-learning for graduate-level online courses. That was the focus. But then there's a lot of transferability to that design. And a lot of that does work around EdTech, and there's a place for that in there, right? But because I also inform myself very deeply from the cognitive science perspective and how really learning happens, so that's where the thoughtful use of technology comes in, right? And there are places, there are moments, there are age groups where it is a complete distraction, and there are places where it makes for learning possible, right? Like we saw that what happened with COVID. The world shut down, but a little bit of learning continued because people were on Zoom and stuff. So I just want to be very clear on that. So it's this notion of that thoughtful pedagogical application, I would say, of EdTech. And there is definitely a place. And Lily, I truly, truly appreciate what you were saying about writing, because writing is not just writing for the product. Writing is the journey of thinking and leading up to the, what we create out of it, right? And then we continue. Sometimes I write and I'm like, it's done. And then I go back to it and I'm like, no, I think more and I write more. So it's really the process that is so essential. And I think technology can be quite disruptive, or can be very how do I say, like, persuasive. Like, it just takes away from what you could do, right? But at the same time, there's some benefits to it. But I wanted to go back to what Phil, you earlier mentioned. You mentioned Paul Kirshner, and of course, he's a really dear friend of mine. And I don't know if you know it, I'm actually in the process of writing a book with him, and it's almost done. So we're going to be submitting a manuscript very, very soon. It is not about ed tech or technology or anything, but it is about becoming an expert teacher. But, there's a lot of application in that idea. But yes, I do subscribe to his work and really align with a lot of things that he says. He's an expert in educational and cognitive psychology. And there's a lot of good value and understanding of how we can apply that in our instructional practice. And I think technology is no different. And I'll give you an example why I say that. When I was writing my PhD thesis, I at that time for the first time connected with Paul, and I emailed him a little shakily, and I'm like, Paul, what are your thoughts on micro learning? Right? It's this idea. I'm working on this, and what else should I be considering? Of course, I was doing my lit review and all that kind of stuff. And then he replies back by saying that learning is learning is learning. You do that for online learning too. You do that for micro learning and e-learning. And so you understand the basics of learning, how learning really happens. And then there are places where technology can really support it. And there are places where technology can be detrimental. But this is all before ChatGPT became a chat option. I mean, generative AI was always there, or for a long time it was there, but the access for a regular everyday person to start chatting with it, because we were all trained to chat with each other, right? Like send messages. That just completely changed so much, right? And so I think Paul's recent piece, he had written about offloading versus outsourcing.
Yeah.
And so that was the essential component. And then I do really subscribe to that idea. And this notion, I think you might have also read the paper by Barbara Oakley, Phil, which is The Memory Paradox, Barbara Oakley and colleagues. And the idea they're basically saying is that knowledge is so essential, even more so now, so that we can actually build off of our ideas. What we don't want to use AI, generative AI, or technology for that matter, for the purpose of doing the thinking for us, but we could probably use it to amplify that thinking, challenge our thinking. And so I think that's the distinction that Paul was trying to make, essentially. There's more aspects to it too. But then EdTech is so much bigger than just ChatGPT, right? I mentioned that I'm a teacher educator, so I also work with teachers who are teaching in the K-12 setup as well. And so it's a lot more than iPads versus no iPads in classroom for younger grades. It's about Chromebooks and doing their written assignment on Chromebook. And that's, as a parent of 3 young kids, has been a concern for me, because I worry that my kids may not even see the need to know the spelling, because if they're writing their, social studies assignment on Chromebook, then they get the spelling wrong and they right click on it and the spelling gets corrected. But there's no learning that actually happened, no processing, that actually happened. And that is worrying. So I'm having to find different kinds of opportunities, for example, with my own kids, where they are researching when they need the technology, but then they compile those ideas and I get them to write cue cards and then write a piece out of that and then handwrite it. And then we talk about the spelling, but it's a big undertaking. And the problem currently I experience, or I feel, is that we as an academic and as a teaching community haven't fully aligned on what is that thoughtful use of ed tech, including ChatGPT or generative AI. What is a thoughtful use is? Because it's kind of like going back and forth between we should completely drop it or we should have it all. That's not the prescription anybody can go with anymore, right? So that's, I'll stop here just to say that that's sort of all over the place, but that's the general take I have. And I think what I always try to do is I try to inform myself from the place of how learning happens. And if there is a case to be made that in this particular case, any kind of EdTech could be beneficial, then let's analyze it and let's use it carefully, cautiously, with intent, with purpose. And if this is just going to be one of the other distractions or a substitution for thinking, then that's probably not the place to have it, right? So that's sort of where I'm sitting with this.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty comprehensive picture that we've got. It is quite, it's not an either or. We need to be careful. We don't want pendulum swings. We don't want fads coming in and out of classroom practice. One of the things that struck me when I've been reading about this is there seems to be a change in thinking generally about what the classroom is for. And I'm going back 5 years now when we did go online. A few of the things there were some real positives. I mean, it sounds weird to say that in time of the pandemic, but from a teaching point of view, we kind of realized we questioned a lot of things we've been doing and a lot of things we've been using the classroom for. And going back to a lot of the literature around flipped learning and thinking, well, maybe the classroom is a place for higher order thinking, discussion, interaction. And at the same time, we had all these quite cool e-learning tools, e-authoring tools, like, micro-learning building platforms that we can put all this material on that students can do the kind of, what do you call it? The less interactive stuff can be flipped out, and then they come into the class and it's all discussion based. I get the sense that's kind of changed a bit now because we're talking about bringing writing back in, partly fueled by ChatGPT and concerns around AI. And I think the sort of things Lily's talking about now, really makes sense. But what do you both have the sense of what is the classroom for? Is it more of a kind of space, as Lily describes, where it's a kind of a peaceful space for thinking where you can have a distraction-free environment? Or is it that interactive space where we're really supposed to be flipping out perhaps some of the things that, Nidhi, you might class as direct instruction and quite valuable to be delivered by the teachers? So maybe Lily, I'll just go back to you with this first. Have you had any change in thoughts as to what the purpose of the classroom is over the past few years?
100%. And I will contextualize this and give a little bit of background with saying that in philosophy, there is very little instruction about how to teach before they make you learn lesson. So, my experience as a graduate student, my conception of what the classroom was for was really just lecturing, straight. That was pretty much my experience in almost all of my philosophy classrooms was, being the recipient of lectures. Some of the better teachers were really, really good at Socratic method and having more dialogue, back and forth conversation in the classroom. But there was literally no writing. There was no intentional time for individual reflection in the classroom. It was really most of my experience. And then what I kind of recapitulated and reified out in my own classes was the same, which was lecture and some Socratic dialogue. I, especially with the release of ChatGPT now, am thinking more about the classroom as a space for mentorship and practice. So I have some elements of direct instruction. I have some elements of individual reflection, some elements of dialogue. I'm trying really to isolate or I guess identify the discrete kinds of intellectual virtues and skills that I want students to be able to develop. And I'm trying to create space for each of those to be practiced. So one thing that I'm trying right now is I start every class. Well, I make a handout for every one of my classes. I've actually eliminated PowerPoint for the most part. And the reason is just because I felt like in my own classes, and this might not be the case for everybody, but just in my class and the kind of content that I cover, I felt like it encouraged some passivity that I wanted to fix. So I make a handout. I start the class with some recall from the previous class. So I ask them to identify some of the major answers to major questions, the things that I'm hoping they will have taken from the last class. We talk about that. I have them write it down individually, and then I try to get them in groups to refine their answers. And then we talk about it collectively, and then we'll make some tweaks. I have them annotate their answers and make some changes. After they do that, I have them read ahead of time before class. I'll have them annotate a smaller portion of text. So again, individually. They look at the text, they will mark it up, make some comments on it. I ask them to just do a short little reflection. This takes about like 10 minutes of why they marked it up the way that they did. What do they think was like the most important phrase on that particular paragraph? I have them discuss again in groups some targeted questions. We discuss those things together as a class. And then I go into a shorter, like Socratic kind of portion of the class where I'm actually giving them my at least interpretation of the text and how I would understand the important things are in that text. I give them some I guess a good outline, I guess, but it's just like topical outline, some of the key concepts or something so that they can fill in some of the things as we're discussing. And then I kind of try to synthesize things towards the end and have them do a little bit more group discussion. So I try to have intentional space for them to dialogue with each other, like in smaller groups, intentional space for them to reflect as an individual, and then space for us to collectively discuss things as a whole. And that's what like my normal class day will look like on a day that we're not doing like in-class writing. So a lot of that is because I want them to practice dialogue. I want them to practice like metacognition. I want them to practice like intentional recall. I want them to make friends. So like that, I mean, quite simply, I want them to be friends with other people in the class. And I feel like all of those things together makes them more engaged in the content. I almost feel like what I've been shifting towards is like almost like a view of centers in like elementary education where there's like small things that I'm having them do and we're constantly shifting. It's not, so even to go back to that concept of micro learning, I don't know if I'm using the term properly, but we're not like just doing one activity, which is like passive receipt of the lecture the entire class period. There's different, activities that are kind of being circulated throughout the duration of the class. So that's the way I'm looking at it now. I'm trying to make the classroom a space where these activities and these tasks can be practiced like in my presence, so that really, because of how tempting it is to not practice those things, all of those things we were assuming were happening outside of the classroom. I think
totally,
we're aware of the fact that it's very difficult to ensure that. But I think it was very difficult to ensure that even before. I think we're just more aware of the fact that that's not happening now.
Yeah, I mean, you start a class banking on everyone having done certain things, and in reality, it was very uneven. Some would have, and some haven't even looked. So you end up kind of recovering the stuff that was supposed to be flipped, but you.
Right.
Nidhi, I'll come into you, and the same question to you in a sec about how you've how your concept of the class has changed. But just to pick up on a couple of things Lily said, I mean, you I think I heard you say in another podcast that you hadn't. One of the presenters asked you how much reading information had gone into your course design. And I think, I'm sorry if I misunderstood this, you said you hadn't read much particularly, but a lot of what you're saying seems to chime with things like the science of learning. And we kind of know that, recall and the things that you're describing work really well. Did any of this inform the way you structured these classes? And I'm thinking particularly about, research around the effect on paper versus screen-based reading, handwriting versus typing, because we know there's kind of studies on this. How familiar are you with the literature on this, and did this inform your thinking, or was it more kind of intuition and experience based?
I was just, as Lily was saying, first of all, I want to say I want to be in your class, because everything that you were explaining was just like, yeah. And this whole idea, you started the question really beautifully, Phil, and I'll come back to the second part of the question as well. This idea that what are classrooms for? And I think that is a really, really important thing that everybody should be thinking about. If you're an educator and if you're a learner, what is a classroom for? That is really powerful. So everything that Lily was saying kind of like made me realize, or like I was able to, in my head, as I was listening to you, Lily was articulating that you were describing a lot of amazing principles of instruction that we've known for about 4 or 5 decades now. Like since the 1960s, the principles of instruction, you said, starting with the recall and bringing students in, And it's a place of where students feel that they know something and they bring something to the table and they feel really empowered by it. But they're not just there for that. They also walk away with a sense of, I built knowledge. Now I know more. So there is an active component and maybe a bit of the passive moment. And it's not so bad to have a passive moment to be integrated in the learning, because as a teacher, as a expert in the classroom, you are also there, but then you bring it back to them and then allow them, give them the opportunity to construct meaning in that moment, right? Mm-hmm. So I was just listening. I'm like, I want to be in that classroom, and it sounds like a really exciting workshop. Every class is like that, and then there's a writing component to it. Just love it. So, and I just wanted to clarify, Phil, if I understood your question correctly, like how the research that I've read about typing versus longhand writing.
Yeah, well, it was the second part. It was also to Lily as well, because I remember I heard her say this as well, that she hadn't actually read much. But I'm recalling a conversation that I listened to you. I listened to you on a podcast. That's been a couple of months ago now, so I might have got it wrong a little bit. But I thought that's kind of what you were saying. You design more by intuition. So yeah, question kind of I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. But yeah, Nidhi, the original question was like, just what's your take on flipped versus this idea of a nice kind of sanctuary classroom that's air gapped from tech and AI? So I appreciate that's a bit of a jumble of a question, but Lily, I'll just pop back to you for a sec. Did I recall that conversation correctly? Did you?
No, that's right. It was there was a couple podcasts that I've been on recently. I think it was the Learning Development podcast. Yeah. So they had asked me like what reading I'd done on this, and to be quite honest, my answer was a lot of it just was intuitive, just like seeing what worked and seeing what didn't. But most of my influences really have been from reading about virtue ethics, and because I'm a virtue ethicist, so I've done a lot of work just in normative ethics, but I have done quite a bit of reading in the literature that really tries to kind of synthesize psychology and social science and philosophy. So on positive, some things with positive psychology, even though I'm not 100% on board with positive psychology, but that's another thing here. But basically, how do we actually build virtue? And that has been the question that has really animated a lot of my own classroom design. So yeah, I haven't done any direct reading specifically on, learning science per se, but probably the more like niche category of character development and like moral education. So I'm thinking about things like, how do I cultivate like humility, and how do I cultivate honesty in a classroom, and like patience, and patience has been one of the ones that I'm thinking about a lot lately. And much of my background as a virtue ethicist is thinking a lot about moral psychology, but in the theoretical sense. So, how do certain habits that we have, like how might these change the kinds of things that we desire or the kinds of things that we believe about ourselves and others, et cetera. Yeah, a lot of that work has been that's probably the more honest answer from, not that I have not done any reading on it per se, but the literature is probably a little bit different than what most would expect for somebody that is being, I guess, intentional about the classroom space. I see it really as a place where I'm cultivating character, and specifically like intellectual character.
Sorry, yeah. So Nidhi, I think the original question I was just thinking about, and please respond to any of that as well. That there was a lot in Lily's answer, but in terms with your familiarity of the literature on what the classroom is for, and did we get a bit carried away with flipped learning, do you think? And when we were kind of exploring this in around 2021 post-COVID, and everyone's thinking, oh cool, this is we should just flip out everything, and students can, because some of it does kind of make sense. It's the idea that students can review the stuff at their own speed. You're in a class, so direct instruction does kind of rely on people being in lockstep to a certain degree, and that might not work in practice. So it kind of makes sense to flip out more stuff and get them to do, especially things like writing outside class. ChatGPT aside, this was before November 2022. So it's not something we were all thinking about. But in that short time between the end of COVID and ChatGPT kind of exploding into everyone's consciousness, were we right to flip things out, or is this kind of slightly misaligned with what we know about how learning happens and what classroom good practice looks like?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I would say the shortest answer is that yes, we did get a bit carried away, and intuitively in the moment, in that dire moment of we just needed to keep that learning going, it seemed like the right idea. But I think it's also really tricky to paint the vast sort of educational space that begins with kindergarten all the way, because at that time all that was happening online, so we can't painted all that. So it was definitely a really, really bad idea in elementary and secondary classrooms, right? There was a case to be made for post-secondary education where we could do that. But even there, we did see that it was not always possible for students to learn. As I said, as in Lily's description of how she designs the class and every session with or without technology, is this notion of students come with a certain level of knowledge to class, but then they walk away with a little bit more knowledge, right? And that's what, for me, classroom is a place for growth and learning. Within the flipped model, we were expecting, I feel, a little too much. And that's what some of the literature also showed. And some students actually need that accountability from the teacher, from the classroom, to actually move. They're not lazy, but they actually need that. Or there was inequity issues with that for our ESL learners, folks who do not speak English as a first language, or there's complete differences in background knowledge, right? So let's say my teacher offered me in a flipped classroom model, I have video 1, this text 2, and another video. Please make sure you watch it. I made the video. It's all good. And I've tried to incorporate all of the explicit instruction principles in there too. But the onus was a little bit too much on the student. And mind you, like that was a very, very stressful time too. So I think that we had hoped to get too much out of that. I haven't read anything currently that has, and I'm sure there's studies on that, and hopefully also meta-analyses that I've looked at. But what happened from the variety of studies that did flipped classroom models during COVID and some years that were afterwards, and what happened to the effectiveness of learning, how effective was that? But what I have read up until that point and a little bit is that yeah, it definitely did not work in elementary and secondary classrooms, and that was definitely not a good idea. And that's why we needed to open schools as soon as we could. It worked a bit for some learners where some learners are just naturally, self-motivated, or they have a lot more support, or they have a lot more controls of accountability, and their background, their home environment might be such. But the other cases, it actually created for some inequity issues, right? Or it widened the knowledge gap a bit more. And again, some of that literature that I did read found that there were not significant benefits when we did that, and definitely some harmful things that came out of it when we did that in younger classrooms as well. So I would say, to answer your question, yeah, definitely. I think we overbought into that. I did it too, because the university said that schools are shut. I was teaching a German course at the time, and yeah, we're going to be following the flipped model. And this is a little bit before I really, really was deep into my cognitive science research. And I tried that and I did it. And in my mind, I thought that I did everything right. I had perfect videos and I posted them all. But then when the students will come into the class, handful, 2 or 3 would have really understood that watching is not the same thing as they got it, right? Even though the video was, let's say, made as best as I could, right? But there is something, and again, there's some multimedia principles that would also account for this, is that there's something when you're, let's say, a math problem or a language, teaching German, you're learning. As I'm writing it, I started using this whiteboard tool called Explain Everything. So I stopped doing the flipped learning because students were not all of a sudden able to come into the classroom and build sentences for me because I taught them in the video. It just didn't work. But then I was like, okay, you know what? I kind of flipped it slightly different. So what I did was I did the synchronous session first, and then the next hour was sort of independent practice. I would remain online, but they did it because 2 hours, 3 hours of Zoom was just a bit of a bullet in the head kind of thing, right? It did not work out like that. So I switched it. And there's lots of evidence saying that, when you're doing as the drawing principle in multimedia principle is like students, when they follow what you're doing in the moment, they're, especially in language structure, if it's a new language or math and other things, they can actually follow you better and they're processing it better. But then so I think we should have done a different kind of flipped learning, starting with the instruction and then leading to independent practice. That sounds like but what we did was like independent study time, and then we'll do it together and we'll just all be so ready to discuss it. But that wasn't the case. 2, 3, 5, 6 handful of students. And for me, that is a classic example of an inequitable classroom, because the educational outcomes are not the same. And that's not why we're in classrooms for. So I would say, yes, we overbought into it. Science and evidence definitely also supports the idea.
Yeah. So I think just for people listening to this might kind of like the idea of, okay, I like the way it's being described so far. I like the idea of having some space in class, perhaps bringing slow writing back in, having slightly less reliance on tech. And all that sounds very uncontroversial. But how have you, and this is a question for both of you, I'm not sure who to start with, but what objections have you found and what difficulties have you found kind of untangling the class from tech sometimes? And I'm thinking particularly around most institutions, especially higher ed, will expect submissions to be electronic. So tech will have to be involved at some point. It's kind of just hard to be without phones generally. Like I was just trying to log into my classroom lectern PC the other day, and I can't do it without my smartphone.
Dual authentication.
Oh my God. Yep. Anyway, tons more things, I'm sure. And just the general kind of attitude around we are really being encouraged, and a lot of institutions might be different on different, countries. Certainly in the UK, we're being encouraged to embrace technology and AI because it is what the students will need. And we need to somehow incorporate this into our work in order to best prepare them for that. Now, I have my own responses to that, and I'm just interested to know, I'm sure you guys have come up with against these kind of talking points before. So I'm interested to hear how you respond to things like that and how you kind of deal with the logistical issues of unplugging sometimes, like, dual factor. And Lily, I'll start with you because it's tricky sometimes when you're on Zoom, you don't know who anyone's looking at. Do you have any thoughts?
Right. Yeah, for sure. So I have so many thoughts. First thing is, I really like to emphasize that not every class is going to have the same solution or is going to have the same level of integration or maybe even non-integration of technology, particularly ChatGPT, in their class. So what I mean by that is I don't necessarily feel like introducing ChatGPT or incorporating that into the paper writing process is super helpful in philosophy, because the learning outcomes that I'm interested in cultivating in students, or that have traditionally always been the purpose of courses in the humanities, is I'm really trying to get students to grow an appreciation for like these big questions that are consequential to their lives. So, what does it mean to be a good person? Like what's a just society? Like these kinds of things. And I want them to really grapple with that in real time with each other. Like that's really what I want them to do. I want them to be able to sit with the difficulty individually, like really wrestle with what some of the outcomes might be for how, and what are the trade-offs and how we answer some of these questions, and appreciate the difficulty in coming up with good answers and being able to talk about those with people that disagree, which is why I have them in small groups and et cetera. So for me, the point is not having them create some like pristine paper that's publishable on, Plato's Republic, or I don't really, this might sound a little crass, but I don't care so much about that. What I really want them to do is be able to grow in humility, their realization that they don't really have the best answers to these questions at present. And it takes a lot of like persistence and resilience and patience to really figure out what the right answers are. And it takes longer than a semester, perhaps even longer than a semester, sometimes years, sometimes a lifetime to come up with like really good answers to these things. People have been talking about them for thousands of years, still have not really settled on what the best answers are. Now, that's not the learning objective for students in finance. And I understand that. I think that these are drastically different things that we need that students are needing to learn in various different classes. And so I think it's okay. And, there's a lot of discretion. I feel like that belongs to the professor and, the particular discipline to really think through what is the appropriate level of, integration of technology, particularly ChatGPT, into these classes. So that's the first thing. I do think that it's very nuanced. It requires really thinking through what is the point and goal of the particular class? What are the outcomes that we need in that particular class? For my class, I really want to teach, patience, appreciation of these big questions, kind of help them be able to practice ethical reasoning in my ethics class in particular. I don't want them to just get the right answer. I want them to really struggle through what the process of coming to maybe a good, better answer might be, not be settled on one specific thing, perhaps. So that still, even if when I nuance it that much, I still get a lot of pushback. And the reason that I get so much pushback is because I do think generally speaking, we have this view of education that it's really about being able to get a job, of course. And I definitely think that there is an element of that. I mean, I was a first generation college student. That was really live concern for me. I needed to have a job. Thankfully, things panned out and I'm able to be a professional philosopher. Did not see that one coming. My parents were not particularly thrilled with that career path either. But I do think that asking, well, what's the purpose of the classroom? We also need to ask, well, what's the purpose of the university too? And there's a lot more that we're trying to do with students, I think maybe that we ought to be doing with students than simply preparing them for a job in some technical sense, that they need to know X skill, Y skill, Z skill. As a philosopher and someone who teaches ethics, I do think that in order to be a good doctor, a good lawyer, a good engineer, you have to be a good person first. And so the technical aspect of all of these things, it's important. They need to know those things. They need to know these skills, especially whatever tools are going to be necessary for them to excel in that particular profession and be able to do well. But they also have to be able to make practically wise decisions, which requires them to be able to sit with nuance, to be able to be patient, to be able to be humble in the face of things that they do not know, to figure out when they need to find more information, blah, blah, blah. And I really view the humanities as being a space where those particular things are developed. That's what I think our little tiny corner of the university, there's a reason why there's, gen ed curriculum, although in many schools, this isn't a state of disarray. It needs to be tremendously reevaluated, but there is a human development aspect of why students are at the university, in addition to learning some of the technical skills that will allow them to excel in whatever, career path they choose. So that's my very kind of long-winded answer and how I would respond. Sometimes technology undermines that human development component, but again, it's extremely nuanced. I don't think ChatGPT is necessary for my students to learn how to dialogue with each other. In fact, I think that, I've seen all these interesting, activities, et cetera, where people are we can have them argue with a chatbot. And I'm why not a person? Why not why don't they just talk to each other? Why do we feel we have to create an activity where we're implementing technology that mimics the real thing? Why don't they do the real thing? Wouldn't that be better to actually talk with a person and learn more specifically how to discuss really hard things with someone that is alive and has their own, passions and beliefs. And, that's why this is important. That's why we would create that activity in the first place, right? Is that with the end of wanting them to be able to have those more polemical discussions with other humans. So anyway, I could talk about this all day, but I will kick it off to Nidhi.
Yeah, no, it's funny that just on that point. Nidhi, I couldn't resist saying I had the same reaction when people went crazy for Kindles and ebooks. I was well, why don't you just read a book? Why is it? I guess it's more portable.
I used to always say when you're traveling, it's lighter. Sure, I get it. So you could travel with 4 more books. But to your point, I mean, even my 11-year-old, she just says that, no, I just want to, and not that I tell her to read a Kindle or anything, but it was a conversation where she's like, no, it's just so nice to hold a book and read it, Mama. And I'm cool, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So I'll try to answer this whole question, and it's bigger than so many things, and Lily, truly appreciate everything and very much aligned with what you're saying as well. I would say one of the things, I think when we see EdTech, ChatGPT, social media, I think there's a problem that we're using them as synonyms now, right? Which is a really big issue, because we can't paint everything with the same color and say all of it is bad, all of it is good. And that creates, as I started this conversation by saying that it's not about being in a polarized, there's enough polarization happening in the world, and we don't want that tech. It's like it's simpler than that. It can be simpler than that if we had a shared understanding of what learning is, what classrooms are for, and what are we all trying to do. The other thing I would say is that we have to have slightly different lenses when we're looking at kids who are kindergartners to grade 4, 5, like a 7-year-old, 10-year-old, 11-year-old kid versus a high school kid who has to do a project on, I don't know, robotics or something like that, versus university students versus, as you said, finance students. So I think you mentioned it, Lily. It's nuanced approach that we really necessarily need. And all teachers, all educators, it would be great. And I know they're all doing that within their own thinking. But what happens is, from the policy perspective, from the system level, university, Senate, or school boards, for example. And I'm in that unique situation where, because I teach the teachers, I see the K-12 classroom. But I teach the teachers, I teach in a university. So I'm teaching the adult post-secondary educators who then will be teaching in K-12 classrooms. So I see that, tension a lot as well, right? And when the school board says, okay, it's a no cell phone policy, I think that's great. But then they have tons of Chromebooks in the classroom. And it's like, then we haven't done enough thinking about it, right? Or when the university says, we want to encourage generative AI, there's extra funding for research for generative AI, rightfully so, because we want to truly understand. That's what the job of university is, to really understand what the risks are, what the benefits are, what the ethics are, what the moral issues are. That's what we are supposed to be doing as academics, moving the field further along to make better decisions. But it's kind of gets really confusing when all these different messages, and we're not picking the strand. And we don't have to be an expert at everything, but I think we have to pick our specific strand and really deeply unpack it and understand that, right? And that's the worry. So on the one hand, we'll receive messaging that all technology is bad, we shouldn't do that in school. And I see that there is a concern with little kids in schools being distracted, phones, and we know that laptops in lecture halls can be distracting as well, cognitive overload, all that happens. But I think, again, it's a very nuanced approach that we need to have. So for example, when I'm teaching my Master of Teaching students or Master of Education students, those are post-secondary students, I mean, we have to use a learning management system, which is EdTech. We post readings, we have discussion threads, but we also have a lot of great conversations in the classroom. And while I have in a classroom, it's a big lecture hall. I have about 180 students in one of my cohorts that I co-teach with a colleague of mine. And we can't have a formative assessment with every single one of them. So we use things like Mentimeter or Slido, and it works really well. But what we have been doing is that from the beginning of the term, we are explaining the evidence behind, well, there are places where there's a place of EdTech and it helps, and there are places where it is a distraction. So that goes to show that, when we are teaching, or when teaching is happening, when actual knowledge building is happening, maybe phones on the side. And I think there is that open, transparent conversation, right? And then same goes for, we're not saying in our classroom that all generative AI is bad, but I also don't want my students to be just using ChatGPT to do the assignment. So as teachers, we're having to come up with, as instructional designers, we're having to come up with more creative ways. And Lily, you've done a lot of that, like, breaking it down in 35, 40-minute writing sessions and thinking through the process. And so we're all having to come up with more creative ways. So one of the things that we did in our Master of Education courses, and I know, Lily, you may not love this idea because it does involve having a conversation with the bot, but in this case, the bot acts as a learner, right? So we want students, let's say we teach them instructional approaches that have a lot of evidence, retrieval practice, or multimedia learning principles, or interleaving, and we've taught them about it. Now they have become an expert, but the bot actually acts as a trainer. So the platform has objectives, and we want the platform to have a conversation with the teacher, future teacher, or the student, And they are basically explaining to the bot. And the bot says, oh, is it like this then? Or is it like that then? And the purpose of that is that we are trying to do more elaborative interrogation, more elaborative thinking on the part of the human in this case. And the bot acts as a learner and nudges and pokes at their ability to be able to explain that. Why we do that is because it is what makes it possible to be able to do that formative assessment with 180 students, right? Point being, it's not, I'm not going to do it because it's all bad, or I'm going to do it, it's all good. It's kind of like there are places where we should do it, and there are creative ways and innovative ways when you can apply that. And there are places where we don't want to do it. Now, if I switched to which my future teachers would be doing, I share with them research about cognitive load, how having a cell phone not on the table, but even in a backpack has shown to increase cognitive load or be a distraction and have extraneous load on the students. Or somebody looks at the watch or something and the class gets disrupted. So we do share that evidence with them also, because in a younger class filled with students who are, anywhere between the ages of grades 1 and 6 or something or higher, what are the impacts? So I think we just continue to have this conversation about it's not all bad, it's not all good. It's really about, it's kind of like a balanced diet, you can't just continue to eat broccoli, but there's days for cookies as well, or balance it out. And I think that's sort of how I'm trying to view it. I'm not saying this is a right approach or wrong approach, but I am wary of saying that everything failed in our education system because we had so much dependence on technology. I don't think that's the case. I think, yeah, it had a role to play, but what about the teaching practices? Maybe we had to look at a little bit more deeply into, did we apply all the evidence-informed practices, or were the teachers really ready? And the last point I would say is that it's the greed from the developers, from the organizations that build these things that are very addictive. And as I said, we also conflate these terms and bring social media in the mix. It's like, no, it's all bad. All social media is dangerous, so all EdTech is dangerous. It's worrying to think like that. And I am concerned about social media myself. I have younger kids, right? So, but we have to really look at apples as apples and oranges as oranges and think about it carefully. But as I said, it's the greed that worries me. So a new platform comes, somebody presents it to, let's say, the university or the school board, depending on where it's going to be. Then the conversation almost always is not that, okay, well, what is the evidence saying that this particular tool can help us with? Then we start thinking, how can we apply this in our teaching now? And I think that's the wrong angle to take. We're trying to fit a head on the hat. It's like, it's not gonna work. You want to find the right kind of hat out there, but it's the greed that worries me. And then there's all these partnerships that happen, and that's where I think our voice as educators, as researchers, is so important. To your point, Lily, building patience, building humanity, building humility in the classroom. And sometimes there's a place for technology for that, and sometimes there isn't, right? And that's what we should be thinking about. And I think we as educators have a really big responsibility to identify what it is for. And sometimes we use it, sometimes we don't. So yeah, I hear opposition, and I always try to stay on the path of large-scale studies, if they are available, have shown that. And if there's not the case, then I would say it's probably not something that I'm willing to just yet give it a try, especially because instructional time belongs to the students. And I think it's our ethical and moral imperative that we use it wisely. So again, very long answer, but completely aligning with what you said, Lily. But at the same time, I think the danger of painting everything with the same color and viewing it the same, I think that would be another, dangerous route to be taking on.
Yeah. Back to this point of, the paper-based writing. And I think the thing that's going to be really useful to people is those of us who are looking for some kind of middle ground when we're dealing with AI, because we're worried about assessment validity. We're kind of aware that take-home digital essays they're not really providing much evidence of what students can do. We're also, the options at the other end of the scale do seem to be kind of limited. We've talked a lot about, obviously you have exams, which don't always capture what we want them to capture. And we have oral assessments, which are extremely time consuming to do. I think what you're describing, Lily, is kind of like a nice halfway house. It's like the writing is supervised, but it's not heavy-handed exam conditions. So this is something that I think really might be appealing to people who are looking for some kind of way of air gapping what the students are doing from AI platforms. How have you made this work in practice? Are you getting the paper-based submissions of the students' work physically handed to you, or do you need to somehow digitize it in order for it to be recognized as a submission?
Yeah, so it changes based upon whether or not I have a TA. And I'll also add that my TAs are not present at my campus. So that is one logistical hurdle that I have. If I'm grading the class myself, I actually made, for all my classes, but I made a physical workbook. And I literally have students like fill this out, and there's like some instruction in here for things that them to think about at home before they come present to class so that they feel like adequately prepared. And they actually write it in here. I collect them and then I give them back. So like part of what I also think makes that effective is like I actually handwrite notes. Now, there's a lot of debate that would be like, okay, well, why wouldn't students just like use ChatGPT to then give them like the best possible feedback? Like it's extremely personalized, extremely time efficient. Like they can get like really nuanced answers on how to improve their writing. I think that's great. If they want to do that after I give them feedback, that would be fine with me. Whatever. What I think that can't do is communicate to students that somebody cares about their growth and their progress, like a person cares about their growth and their progress. And I think that is a hugely important aspect of motivation, like for students in the classroom. And it's a really important aspect of like virtue, right? So I do think just like seeing that a person has graded their work and has taken the time and the attention to like actually devote to their work, I think that they associate that with like them. This is part of me. This is something I produced, and like a teacher is looking at it and a person is looking at it and giving it attention, blah, blah, blah. So if and when I can, I grade it myself and put notes on it. When my TAs help with the grading, I basically have students take a picture of their handwritten work, and then they just submit that to Canvas like a picture file. And the TA will grade that and add notes to it on Canvas. But I still want the TA to read it and make themselves available. So I try to emphasize the importance of, there needs to be a human here. Again, because it's not just about like the product itself being like the best philosophy paper ever written. Like that's not the point entirely. I want them to really sit with and understand why these questions are important to really grapple with in the first place. I want them to think through them. I want them to have modeled to them that other people are thinking through them, and that I value the questions too and value their input on the questions, all that stuff. And then what I typically do is after students, turn in one section, I will give kind of like very meta level feedback to like the whole class. Like, here are some of the general things that I've noticed in a lot of people's argument maps. Like, here's some things that you want to keep in mind. I noticed that this a lot. So I give kind of individual feedback and then kind of the meta level feedback. And I tell them to like look at their own stuff as I'm giving the meta level feedback and take notes if they notice that. So anyway, that's how I manage it. I have them like take a picture if I have a TA that is helping with some of the grading, and then they submit that to Canvas, or I just collect it and will grade it myself. I will say when I do collect these, it is very cumbersome. Like the bag is heavy and I have to like drag up to my office on the second floor of this building. But it's funny because I really do think even that communicates to students, like, I am committed to this.
Yeah.
I'm committed to you and growth. Like, you see me like lugging in pounds of these notebooks.
Yeah.
Like, she's serious.
She cares.
She really cares. Like she
Yeah.
wants me to learn. And I will say, I think that, or at least the feedback that I've gotten from a lot of students, that definitely is what is being communicated for sure. I think I get a lot of that feedback especially from my in-person classes from students.
Yeah, I used Adobe Scan, I think, for because I'm doing kind of a similar thing. I was just wondering now how to deal with the submission, because I'm really improvising this. A lot of what I've done is based on, following your work, and it's been really interesting.
Well, thank you.
But yeah, I got a little app. So Adobe Scan does a little bit of a better job than the regular phone camera.
Taking pictures.
Yeah, it's less blurry.
You're-
It's so interesting because it's just like, it feels like the system was not designed for this. Because I went to uni, and you have that submission hatch, and the shutter would come down at 12 o'clock or whenever the deadline was, and you.
Right.
Yeah. I remember when I was, obviously, this is before all of this, the Dropbox in the office, you
Yes.
could go on Dropbox, like after hour Dropbox, because it wasn't like the canvas would shut down at 11:59 Eastern or whatever.
Right,
You just
right.
drop it in, and it was just kind of nice. But I was just loving that book that you shared. And again, I know I've said it twice, but I will say it third time. I would love to take your course.
Oh,
Because it
thank
feels
you.
like it's what a student wants. You want a teacher that cares, has something to share, but also has something, that desire, the time, the commitment to hear from you, and that what they write matters, right? So I think so very similar stuff in some of my writing courses that I teach, but not to the level of that you're doing. But sometimes I'm working with international students. Very similar stuff I do. So they're writing shorter paragraphs, but what I get them to do, if it's an online course, is that I give them time during class time, and I say, if you have an iPad, write it on your app, iPad, and using Apple Pencil, and that automatically creates a digital file. For other students, I just say, I'm going to wait. Go grab a pencil or a pen and a paper, because nobody has them in front of them. They must be sitting in front of their computer doing this online course. And I say, I'm going to wait. Go grab them and just turn on your camera for one quick second, just to show me that you have it. And then write it down. And then, of course, as you said, Phil, Adobe Scan or take a picture and upload it. And then I will try to just mark it, annotate it online itself. But it is more work, yes, but it is absolutely necessary, especially in writing courses, for sure. And I would say within the scope of assessment, that was the conversation. So with writing, these are some really great ideas, but I've also shifted to, if it is not writing related, to a lot more, many low stakes, or almost sometimes zero stakes retrieval practice kind of quizzes, right? Like, and we know that and we'll give multiple attempts to students. We'll say it's open book. And what is seen is that they'll get, let's say, 89 out of 100. And they're like, okay, they don't know what they got wrong, but they just see their score. So they'll do it again, and they'll do it again until they get 100. And I'm like, my mission is accomplished. You're gaining mastery of the content, because you then have to repeat everything just to see. I have a feeling, I think I got question 15 maybe wrong, because I was confused there, but they have to do all the way. So I've also, in the context of assessment, if it is not related to writing, started doing a lot more formative, low stakes, retrieval practice, I would say. And there's lots of great tools for that. Google Forms does it really well, or Microsoft Canvas has its own inbuilt quiz in there and stuff, so you can do multiple attempts. So I think it's, again, going to this idea, communicating that this assessment is not just a formality. I genuinely care that you learn, right? It's assessment for learning. So we continue to move forward in that journey, rather than let me penalize you. And, I think that communication, to your point, carrying all those books shows that you care. You're serious about it.
Yeah. It's interesting too. I've noticed when I do prepare like the handouts, I'll just like show you a little example of one of them. But when I do like prepare like these handouts and like have things for them to like fill out, and they have like the individual like tasks on them, I don't like grade these. I don't collect them. I don't give them any points, but like every student is doing them. Like every student's like filling things out. Like when I tell them to annotate, no one's like sitting there like, I refuse to participate. I might have like, actually now that one person that kind of does that on the regular. But for the most part, like they keep these, they can use them as like study tools for later, but they have like an artifact that kind of shows them like what they took from the class, which I think has been super helpful. And I really appreciate what you said too, just about how writing itself, which, I did know, I guess, before I broke up with PowerPoint this semester, but it definitely does make a huge difference. It's interesting how you even passively seeing the words on the screen versus actually doing work on the board and writing things out and having them write things out, and trying to piece together things from the argument that they read on their own versus just seeing the argument outlined on a piece of paper. Very, very different processes. And I think that's part of why this has been a lot more effective for me. I kind of I threw this idea together at the beginning of the semester, and I've been really pleased with the results. I feel like they're just with me more.
Yeah. Well, you're doing something really, really amazing, and your students will always remember it. I'm only hearing about it and they're experiencing it. So I think it's amazing. Thank you.
I appreciate that from someone who knows the science behind it much more than I. I'm glad that you're giving me that affirmation because I'm on the right place.
I do often say that there's a lot of common sense to cognitive science. You just have to pause, and Phil knows exactly what I'm talking about. We talked about this. It's you just have to think what is going through a learner's mind, and you just and then you say, oh, and a lot of the cognitive science actually came in later. It was observing master teachers doing what they were doing. That's the biggest thing that Rosenshine and colleagues did back in 1960s and 70s, is that they just wanted to observe what are expert teachers or master teachers doing before labels were given to these things, right? Sure. And they were noticing that, oh, they're doing this, and this is the evidence. It's kind of afterwards. So it's fascinating. So, listening to your that gut, but at the same time, you're receiving feedback from when you do something, it works. And if it doesn't work, then you iterate it. So that's another really powerful thing that as an expert teacher you do, is that you're taking that feedback from how it is landing from when you do it. So that's exactly what I think all teachers should be doing. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. On that note, I actually have to
go teach
a class.
Yeah.
Well, I'll teach. Go do that writing course of yours, and create more wonderful writers in the world and philosophers. And it was such a pleasure meeting you.
Yeah, such a pleasure to talk to both of you. I can't wait for this to come out. Thank you so much for your patience and putting all this stuff together.
Thank you, Phil. Really appreciate it. You're always such a wonderful voice to be speaking with, and it's really wonderful. I enjoy chatting with you every single time.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bye-bye.